your life was the brewery. You know, you didn't leave the job because it was such a good job. You know, it paid well, there's lots of overtime, you weren't just a number, you clocked in, and when you clocked out, you're still part of the brewery. You know, that was it. The brewery was your family.
I don't think it's a coincidence that the surviving breweries in London for so long were mostly those along the Thames, because that was one of the important aspects of London brewing, that you had the Thames as a terrific route in for your raw materials.
Most people lived local because you had Watney cottages, which was next door to the brewery, and then you had 2 blocks of flats. I think it was Reed House, Coombe House and Watney House, and that's where originally when you got a job there, you got a flat as well, or a house to live in, as part of the job.
Where I was born, it was backed on to Watney's, so it was right in front of our bedroom windows, so you could smell the hops and malt and barley and everything, and the beer, and you could hear the noises of the lorries and the horse and carts, and we used to go down to the stables along the river and feed the horses when we were kids.
I lived just the other side of Wandsworth roundabout when I was a baby, you know. And Mum used to walk me down the road by the hand, and I could smell the brewery from there. The hops and the horses was up and down there as well, you know. And so I got a sort of long memory of the horses and that smell. You sort of grew up with that smell.
We were always Youngs of Wandsworth, never Youngs of London. It was always Wandsworth that we identified with. And yeah, I think the local community were very proud. I mean, apart from the fact that they would all have at least one relative who worked in the brewery, everybody felt connected to it.
The one thing about the breweries that I worked in, there was a big sense of community, even at Watney. So in Watney's brewery, people were there, 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation. And if your father worked in the brewery, the chances were you worked in the brewery as well.
There are lots of families. I mean, there's one in particular that did 250 years. One of the sons was a drayman, another of the sons worked in the brewing area. One of the sons was a driver. He's still alive, he's 90 years old now.
Well, yes, a lot of people in the brewery were interrelated. You had to be a bit careful if you were talking about somebody in a sort of rather derogatory way or something. You might sort of say, oh, you're talking about my brother-in-law.
Mortlake was the biggest employer in the district. And so, as far as I was concerned, and my parents were concerned, to get a job in the brewery, you know, you're made for life.
My mum's cousin, who was a plumber in one of the breweries, was down for afternoon tea, as you did in them days. And he said, what did you want to do? And I said, I'm not sure. And I explained what I was doing at school. And he said, have you thought of trying brewing? I said, no. He said, well, I know they send you to college. I thought, well, that sounds like the answer to a prayer, because I was the oldest of 4, and money was tight. So if I could get a job which was going to educate me at the same time, brilliant, and get paid for it.
My mother, by the time I left school, had been working in the payroll department for the brewery for a number of years, and When I'd left school, my father pushed me to be, wanted me to be an electrician. So now every year they took on one fitter, a mechanical, and one electrical. So I went for the interview with my mum, and basically the interview was, can you play football? Can you swim? Can you play cricket? And the answer to that is, yeah, not bad, any of those. He said, you've got the apprenticeship and you're playing for the third team next Saturday.
But my stepfather at the time, who was Vincent Hanrahan, was the foreman in the bottling hall. And he said to me, oh, I can get you a job in there. And I said, no way. And he left it, right? And then I got a phone call from, I think it's Michael Ives, who was another foreman, and he said, you've got to come for an interview. So I went there, and I remember going there, 18-year-old, right, hair all over because I had an afro, jeans on, chewing gum, and I sat there and I looked around, thought, oh my God, what kind of place is this? Anyway, Michael Ives asked me several questions, and then he said, do you want this job? I said, no. So he says, well, why are you here? I said, because I was sent here. And he said, right, okay, you start on Monday.
I met the chemist, and he gave me what I thought was a very thorough interview. He then took me to see the head brewer, and then at the end of that, he said, okay, he said, let's go for a beer. And I thought, oh, that's just what I wanted to hear. So the two of them took me to the old sample room, and they said, what do you want, a glass of beer? So I gave me a glass of beer, which I drank. It was very nice. And then they said, we try the special. I said, oh, I'll try that as well. So I had a quick glass of special. And then the second brewer came in, and he went, have you tried our Old Nick? It's a very good bottle, try this. And he gave me a bottle of the Old Nick. And then somebody else came in from the warehouse and said, oh, have you tried our light ale? Here it is. And everyone who came in and wanted me to try a different beer. And I was trying all these beers. I had a fantastic time. So, the funny thing is that what was actually happening is that Youngs, the guys I was going to work with, wanted to get the true and honest John Hatch. So they got me completely legless to find out what I was really honestly like. So the interview only started in the sample room.
I wrote to 30 breweries and was given 2 job offers. One was Fuller's and one was Truman's at Brick Lane. And I actually turned the Brick Lane job down because I was going to be one of 20 old lab technicians. And when I said, do I go out around the brewery sampling and testing and whatever, and they said, oh, no, we've got 2 lab technicians for that. But with Fuller's, when I asked the old head brewer then, he said, oh, no, you have to go out and get the samples, of course, nobody else do it for you. So it was great, and then I could go out, see the process, sample the beer, go back and test it, and then go back again and tell them what I found. So you had a complete loop, which I sort of enjoyed that side of it a lot.
When I first started there, I think there's between 2,500 and 3,000 people worked there, because you had all the transport divisions, so they were delivering all the beer around London, and you had, as I say, all the old people that did all the barrels and the coopers and all these sorts of things. So it was a big thing. And
you wouldn't have imagined that so much was going on in such a small space. You know, you walked in there and you walked around and you looked and you thought, wow, how are they getting away with this? Because it was, you know, it wasn't, I say it was, what's the saying? It was controlled mayhem, I would say, but it worked.
I liked the fact there was loads of beer barrels knocking about, and I loved all the machinery, this sort of Victorian conveyor belts that used to go around everywhere, and everything was moved by these chains. I mean, in this day and age, it would have been probably a health and safety nightmare, but it was really quaint, and everybody, all the engineers that run it, they knew everything inside out. It was incredible.
I think my first recollection working at Fuller's was the barrels, because barrels had right of way, and they used to go across the yard and they used to roll them, and you could hear the barrels going across. And then later on they took that away, and you missed not hearing the barrels.
And there'd be a man at each junction, and these barrels would be hurtling along at speed, and it was their job to turn them off right or left, or stop them, or fill them, or sniff them, or clean them, or do whatever they needed doing at that point. And then there was a very primitive lift. It was like Heath Robinson, really, but it worked. It worked.
The casks used to get rolled across the yard, so with the horses coming in, I mean, they could have been rolling through the horse shit as well.
In the old days, it was copper and wood, and it was very, very old. It get run down, and it was sort of held together with bits of sellotape and string to keep it going. You know, the walls used to move with cockroaches and flies, and it wasn't. You wouldn't want to drink a pint of beer if you knew how it was made back then.
There was lots of noise and banging, hammering. Cast when you take out the bungs is a noisy operation. There's always that going on. Lots of steam everywhere. Lots of leaks here and there, water everywhere.
And you'd walk in and you had the gatehouse to your left, and you walk along. Then you had the lab, and you had the brew house on the right, and then you had the cast yard, where they used to knock the bungs out, tip all the. That's when you had you'd say the dregs, where all the hops and the tip that all out, and that's where the smell came from. And you just see these blokes, rain, winter, sunshine, they were out there, bang, 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 and that you could hear that noise.
For the first 6 months was real training, because I mean, you know, you were fresh out of school, so you knew. I mean, I knew a bit about the process from talking to my father, but you learned all the basic analysis, so how to do alcohols, gravities.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of it was on the job training. So we did various courses, in-house courses largely. But then as I progressed from the laboratory through onto the brewing side, I was, if you like, it was very much sitting by experienced brewers and being shown how to make beer in that particular brewery.
I had to do virtually every job in the brewery and go and spend a week at a maltings and a week picking hops or working with the hop merchants and seeing how hops were bought and sold as well. So he gave me a very thorough induction.
Forklift training, when I first started, it was get on the truck, this does that, that does that, that does that, forward, reverse. There you go, that was it.
Well, I started out as a brewing room boy, and that was to generally clean up at the brewing room after the brewers. I then moved into the brew house in late 1966 as copper boy, looking after the boiling copper.
One of my jobs was to change the bulb on the jetty. You had to climb up the lamppost sort of thing and hang over the river. And fight the rats off this jetty to change the light bulb, and always the apprentice got that job because he's always the smallest one and the lightest one, so you got to shimmy up there and change the light bulb.
So I ended up working in the bottling stores for about just over a year, fixing the machinery like a semi-skilled fitter. Then it's like here, once you get in the doors of the brewery, any jobs that became available within the walls of the brewery before it went outside, you had first dibs at really, and the job in the stables came up and I applied.
We used to come in the morning at 6:30, and we had a pool of labourers, and I was one of the pool, you know. There was about, I remember it was about 8 or 10 of us some days, and used to gather in the yard, and then our foreman used to come up to Harry Wagner, his name was, the man that took me on, lovely man. He used to come up there and say, right, Ted, and he'd call me Ted, you go along with so-and-so on the transport, you go in the tun room, you go there, you go. So it was, you know, and anybody else that was left over that didn't have a job would be knocking bungs out of barrels in the yard, you know, when they was being cleaned.
Obviously we had the brewing staff who answered to the board, and they were producing the beer. The beer would then be pumped around the brewery, where it would either go into cask or into keg or into bottle. All these different departments had a building with their own team of people working there, all highly specialised. We then had transport, who would take the beer out. So we had drays with associated stables and horses, and we had motorised wagons who drove the beer for larger distances. We had a garage on site who maintained the drays and the wagons. Other support staff, we had carpenters who were literally spending every day rebuilding the bits of the brewery which had been falling down or been damaged by a cask rolling into them. We had electricians, the cooper who was providing casks, and everyone was equally as overjoyed when we got a gold medal. From the yard upwards right through to the directors. It was a massive team effort. Everyone here did their thing.
I was head brewer, which meant I was responsible for all of the production of beer on site, from the purchase of the raw materials to the quality of the beer in the public house estate.
We were working to a formula. When I was in Brick Lane, we ended up brewing, for example, lots of Carlsberg. So there you're just working to somebody else's beer recipe, etc. You're not having much input, but here I've been able to have an input into some of the way the processes worked, an input into some of the beers, new beers, or modifications to existing beers and things like that. So you feel like you're having an impact, if you like, an effect. You are having a genuine role in what's coming out and reaching the final customer. For me, there's a real satisfaction in that.
I always liked the brewing side because, you know, you're making, especially if you're making bitter, takes a week to make, and you know that after 2 weeks it'll have all been drunk. So there's sort of good job of satisfaction there.
A typical working day would be come in at 8 o'clock and start general duties, either moving the hops from the hop loft up to the copper and get them ready to put into the copper.
Manually tip in bags of malt as well. So you quite often do about 80, 50 kilo bags straight in the mornings.
There's 5 flights of stairs and there was no lift. So everything that either came up was carried up, or there was hoists.
Do you know what? I loved my sack barrow. Sounds sad, doesn't it? But believe it or not, it takes a long time to be able to wheel up a 50 kilogram bag of malt and flip it just at the right distance so that all the malt goes into the little hole hatch. And it took me ages to perfect that. I'd have malt flying all over the place. I couldn't even run it up the gantry when I first done it. So yeah, I enjoyed doing that, I think.
The copper was about 16 metres deep. So you got in by a ladder. You had to climb down when they were cleaning it. While people were in the copper, there's a tank above it, could be filling up with hot wort.
I started off as a junior brewer, which meant that I effectively was acting as a supervisor, and I would do my turn at mashing in the morning at 5 o'clock and do my turn at finishing the brew, which usually finished about 8 o'clock in the evening.
A typical day for me as a brewer: arrive at the crack of 6 o'clock, run up to the mash tun floor where I was met by the foreman, a guy called Mick Lewis, great big muscular guy. I'd always say, "Morning Mick, how you doing?" He'd always glare at me, and if I was lucky he would say, "Fair to middling." And he'd be sat on the table waiting for me, although I was always exactly on time, under a no smoking sign, puffing away on a rolled up cigarette. I'd always say, "Mick, you can't smoke in here." And he wouldn't answer me. He'd say, "You're going to start then." And there were 2 mash tuns, and the brewer would take 1 mash tun, the foreman would take the other. And basically you had a tap, 2 taps, hot tap and a cold tap, to get the right temperature, and a thermometer. And you had a big black wheel. And the idea was to open the taps and turn the big black wheel. And the black wheel opened a slide which allowed grist from the grist case to fall into what's called a Steele's masher, which was like a churning, rotating screw. So you get water gushing in through the sides, grist coming in from the top. And at the end of this screw, you get this mash.
You had a thermometer on a stick so that you could put it into the mash to tell the temperature. and you also had cyclometers to measure present gravities, etc. So those were the basic tools of a brewer. Other than that, it was a pen and piece of paper for calculation.
And then eventually the wort would come from the coppers, you'd allocate it into the fermenting vessels, and then hand over to the finishing brewer, as they were called. And then the morning brewer could go home early, which was lovely. I used to go to the cinema actually and watch a film in the afternoon. I loved it.
The first runnings from the mash tun are very strong, and the last runnings are quite weak. So the second copper was weak, the first copper was strong. And then you would blend them together going into fermenting vessel. In order to work out the proportions, you had to understand quadratic equations. Before we got calculators, and we had calculators, everybody used to have to do this on slide rules and whatever. And if you got it right, then you got the beer right at the end. If you got it wrong, then you had to add water, or if it was too weak, then you had no options.
Yeah, it wasn't very hygienic, you know. Pigeons everywhere in the grain silos, mice in the silos, grain silos, weebles in the grain. So it wasn't very good. But then again, by the time it's been boiled and cooked and fermented, you know, all your bacteria is gone. So it's okay by then. It's just the initial when the ingredients went in because it was so old.
Within 3 days of arriving here, the guy who was running the laboratory came up to me and said, look, I'm not a microbiologist, he said, but I've just done some swabs, and he said, you better have a look at these plates. And all of the counts were very, very high in terms of potential infection.
When I first started in 78, a mixture of conical vessels, fermenting vessels, which was the latest thing that Red Brewery brought in, and they're all stainless steel, in-place cleaning systems, and they were quite easy to produce a clean vessel every time before you use it. But the other half was what's called open squares, which is big vessels with a different yeast that grows on the top, sort of foaming yeast on the top. And that was very much a manual operation to clean those and keep those clean. And obviously it was exposed to the air as well. So there were lots of inherent problems, micro problems with those, and cross-contamination as well. So I was into the bugs, and the bugs were the problem with Fuller's. It did have another name, Fuller's, in those days. I don't know if you picked up on that yet. It was called Full of Shit and Turnips, was its old name. And when I was my previous job before I started here, they said, why are you going there? The beer's terrible, you better off go and work somewhere else. So I regard that as a bit of a challenge. So we pushed all the bugs out the system basically until sort of beginning of the 80s. It took a couple of years to get it all sorted out, and with the extra investment that went on as well, meant that we ended up actually with clean, pure, cultured beer.
It was in the 70s that Young's got really, the beer got very popular, and we only had the Victorian brew house, so we were working around the clock to get the beer brewed, which suited us because we'd all got mortgages and we got overtime for it.
It's really funny because you always had, in those days, brewers were in charge, traditionally in charge of places, in charge of areas. So you had a brewer that's in charge of brewing, and then you had one in charge of filtration and tanks, and you get one in charge of packaging or a type of packaging. And I always thought the packaging brewers should be paid more because brewing to some degree is very much bulk liquid production, whereas packaging, it can be a by-the-minute nightmare. In terms it's fast moving, you've got a limited time to do what you need to produce, you've got people waiting to collect it, you've got materials arriving, you've got to put the right liquid in the right bottle with the right label with the right date of the right quality. You've got to pull all that together very quickly.
Bottling, when I started in industry, was largely done for what we called the tide trade, for pubs. So we would be bottling into returnable half pints that would go into the pub in wooden cases, plastic cases. They would then go back to the brewery, deposited. You'd have to wash them, refill them, etc. But it was a nice closed loop.
Big balance of men as opposed to women, because it was very physical work. But the exception to that were the ladies in the bottling hall. Absolute tigers.
It was from the war, basically, you know, that women were employed in bottling lines, and it continued on after that. It was the only area that we had female labour in terms of shop floor.
We clocked in with the old-fashioned clocking machines, so we had to be on the production line for 7:30. So it wasn't just about walking through the door. You had to be in your wellies, overalls, headphones, gloves, and down on the shop floor, because obviously production line, if there was any hold-ups, then it put everything behind. When I first started, when we used to do the quart bottles, all that used to be hand. We used to put them on the conveyor by hand. They go around the filler. Sometimes, if they had a tiny crack in them, airline crack, they used to explode, so that was terrific. So there was always a lot of noise. I had to learn to lip read as well, and to lip read bad language, because nobody spoke normally in there. You know, if you didn't swear, then you weren't part of it, you know, so I learnt my choice swear words in there. Most of them was all right. Some of them, well, the men were scared of them. You know, they were kind of tough and very mouthy and everything. And, you know, sometimes, you know, if there was a young boy start or something, they'd tease the life out of him.
And I went down there and they said, hello, we've got a new piece of meat. I thought, probably going to kill me here.
But I was taken to one side when I first came in 1988 as a young postgraduate, and I was told, be very careful in the bottling hall, because the bottling girls, if they catch you, they'll do bad things to you. And I said, what sort of bad things? Oh, really bad things. I said, well, how bad? And I was told that they would actually take my trousers down and my underpants, and they would shave me, and they would then apply lipstick. Now, I hadn't gone through that before, and I wasn't going to go through it either, so I decided there and then I would always be very discreet in the bottling line, and I would open the door and peer through to make sure there was nobody around. And I would slip in, get the bottles, turn and run as fast as I could back to the laboratory, and I would be heaving gasps of breath and relieved to finally make it in one piece. But they never caught me, thank goodness.
The majority were women in there, in our department. You had the men that was the charge hands and did kind of like the heavier lifting, but most of us did it, we all did heavy lifting. And I remember we was trying to get equal pay, because it was that long ago. And I remember having to, they said, right, if you can put a case together to say that you women work the same as the men, then we'll consider it. So I weighed crates, I did everything, went to them and said, well, basically, we're doing the same job. So, you know, they put us on equal pay.
Yes, there were two coopers. They had a full workshop all set up, which was an amazing place to go into, especially if somebody who never seen a cooper shop before. They had everything, stays, the wood, they had everything, and it was all pristine. And the skill they had just putting a barrel together, to watch somebody do that is, yeah, it's amazing, really.
Yeah, it's like being in a Dickens novel in the workshop. Old tools, Victorian tools, same methods, but skilled men.
Yes, I mean the wooden casks tended to have a sort of pitch lining, and if that got pitted, then you'd be through to the wood. Very, very prone, very difficult to wash because you can't heat them up and sterilise them through heat. So not particularly good for cleaning. Also very heavy to handle. Stainless steel and aluminium came in after that.
I think it is fair to say that there was a division between the transport blokes and the inside workers, and there were the inside workers and the outside workers. partly because the transport were on a different payment system, which was called job and finish.
Now the dray's job is to come in the morning, get your tickets for your daily work, and you would come round here with a truck, the lorries would back up onto the loading bay there, and you would throw your boxes down, wines and spirits. In those days, the canned beers were around the side here, and they used to handball them up to each other. Then you go back round onto the loading dock in the brewery there and load your barrels and your kegs on. And then you'd be off, and so the thing about it, once you was out on the road, you was your own governor.
And sometimes we'd have 3 loads of beer, which might be just 3 pubs, you know, it might be 8 ton of beer for one, 8 ton for the second one, 8 ton, you know, unload it, come back, load up, go out again, so on and so forth. And it was job and finish in them days, and we was finished by 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock every day, you know, and that was the beauty of that.
We used to have like old Bedfords where you had the gear stick, and it felt like you had a long day at work, because years ago you trying to get it into gear, driving along, that was half your day's work. You're tired by then, and then you used to be baking hot in the cab because all the heat used to come through the bottom of the engine.
Again, learning a new skill. So, you know, flipping kegs off a side of a lorry, getting them into a pub, some of them very low ceilings, using the old, the skids. Some of them was rickety, and you had to rope them down, and that's when we used to do the barrels of bitter. So they were like that tall, about that wide, and you had a rope and you're standing there on this wooden thing, you can hear it creaking, and you've got your mate at the bottom, and if you let it go, so you've got to hold on to it and slide it down.
And you've got a 36-gallon wooden barrel dropping it down a 10-foot cellar. And I mean, once they pushed them over the side, they had to know what they were doing, that rope, and you know, it was an art. And then you see a little guy, and they used to put all the barrels up on the stillions, and you see a little guy, and you know how heavy these things are, and just they used the momentum of the fluid inside, and they could twist it, throw it, put it up on the stillions, and it was a work of art. It was absolutely brilliant, and they could do it so quickly as well.
Dave Kinnard was in the cellar, and he was sending up the empties, and we used to stack them about 3 high. So I've grabbed 2, and as I've spun round, I've knocked the one there, and I ain't thought nothing of it. And he's gone, "Oh, I saw you." I've just knocked him on the head. There's blood pissing off his head. And Alex is on the floor crying with laughter, and he's just like, "I've nearly killed a man." You think it's funny, well, that's what it was like. You know what I mean? He was all right. We went home and didn't see him for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, they got allowance of beer, and at every stop they also got a pint of beer. So on some occasions, before the drink driving laws took place, you'd have people coming back in and open the lorry door and out they come. Yeah. And they pick themselves up off the cobbles out there, walk into the office, pick up their next load and go out and deliver again.
I think you would notice there was a lot more formality in those days. Certainly in the offices, everyone wore a suit. You wouldn't dream of turning up not in a suit and tie. The systems were very simple, but everything was manual. So paperwork was all manual, paper everywhere.
Obviously the first day was the busiest day on the Monday. We'd get all the clock cards in, because in those days you had to clock in and out. And we had to check every single clock card for the whole brewery, because they were allowed to be no more than 15 minutes late a week. If you were more than 15 minutes over the whole week, then your pay was deducted for the minutes you, so we had to know how much a minute they earned. And then there'd be overtime pieces of paper in those days with overtime on for various people. Transport, they used to get a bonus, we'd get that come in as well. All that sort of thing, and all that would take most of the day to check that. And on the Tuesday morning, we would actually work out the wages. They paid in cash in those days, so we had to work out how many notes we wanted. We had to get it down to the nearest to the penny. And of course, I'd been used to having a contometer, to work with, to do when you do the manual payroll, there's a lot of additions to do and working out overtime rate. Well, Keith never had any machines at all. He didn't believe in them. This is what you use your brain. So, of course, I had to quickly learn how to do manual arithmetic again.
One of John Young's passions, apart from people and beer, was animals, and he loved horses. In fact, he loved all animals. And even though it probably became more cost inefficient to use a horse compared to a motorised wagon, he insisted that we used to have horses here to deliver beer.
We had 4 pairs on the road, so that was 8 horses going out with 4 drays, we called them, or horse and carts. And we would deliver in up to a 3.5 mile radius.
When I first started, I didn't go out on the road for about a year and a bit, I suppose. So it was I mainly done stable work then, was mucking out the horses and putting down clean beds when required, brushing horses, cleaning all the harness, all the sort of jobs that had to be done on a daily basis.
Farrier was a very strong man, and we had a very hot, in the winter, a great place to go and watch him, and school children used to come in and watch him, and he would actually make the shoes here, make them, the whole process, and he would have the furnace going, and the horses would be tied in there and he would lift them up, the legs of the horses.
My first experience of actually going out with the horses, I went out as a third man, because you had 2 guys worked on the with the horses, and if you had a new horse, they'd bring a spare man out to make sure the horse stood still where it was stationary when they was delivering the beer, and I'd done that for quite a few months. In general, it was, you know, everybody knew us, and everybody used to wave to you going along the streets, and if you pulled up a job out, you would get quite a lot of people come around and speak to you. So in some ways it was a bit of an advertising tool for the brewery as well, the horses being out on the road. And I always looked at it, if you saw a lorry outside a pub, you wouldn't go and stroke the front of the lorry, would you? If you saw a horse, you'd go and stroke him, wouldn't you?
But the horses, yeah, there was a few characters there, you know what I mean? There was one, you'd have to watch him because if you didn't, he'd give you a little nibble. And that's it. I mean, so he had them big chompers, so if he didn't, you got caught.
Having the horses here made a difference. You know, you live in industry in a sort of mechanised world. To have the horses, you know, sort of, you get sort of great big burly sort of draymen coming down here, sort of had a bad day and sort of start talking to the horses, going coochie coochie, and you know.
And as time went by, John Young got things like peacocks in the stables to sort of brighten the place up, which was fun. They were absolute pests, the peacocks. Big bird, very, very small brain, always getting in the way of drays and walking through puddles of acid, and you name it, they did it. And they often used to flutter over the wall and try to escape, and they were eagerly caught by the locals wanting to get a free pint of beer by returning these peacocks. So it was complete carnage.
But what was always interesting was we had the nativity scene at the end of the yard there on the main road. And the nativity scene every year was quite exciting. The people were obviously statues, but everything else was live, and we'd have the sheep would go out there, the ramrod would go out there, and the donkeys would go in, and the horses used to be hanging around a bit too. And we'd often get a Shetland pony stabled on here who was doing probably the pantomime. So the Shetland pony had been there as well. And all the kids used to stop. And I remember coming in one morning and standing over this stable and looking at it, the kids and families all the way around. And I leant over there, and the donkey grabbed hold of my tie and it chewed it until it got right up, until there was just me and the donkey like that. And he couldn't let go of my tie. You can imagine what that was like. Mildly embarrassing, but also wondering how on earth I was going to get rid of it with all the kids rolling around with laughter. That was, it was such fun. It was great fun, those sort of things.
The life was the brewery. You know, you didn't leave the job because it was such a good job. You know, it paid well, there's lots of overtime, you weren't just a number, you clocked in, and when you clocked out, you're still part of the brewery. At Christmas, there was a big Christmas party for all the kids in the canteen, and everyone would take their kids there and they'd all get a free present. So as I say, it was all geared around the family.
I think Young's was the most sociable brewery in the country, and I was told this on many occasions by lots of people who came to visit us. Any excuse for a party and we would do it. We had the most lavish Christmas dinner dances. It was just a wonderful place to work, really, very, very sociable, very friendly.
So we had an association to organise inter-brewery sports, which was great at bringing people together, both from within breweries, cross-functional teams, and against other breweries. So you could be playing anything. We had 20-odd disciplines, from bridge and darts and snooker right through to quite high-level football, tennis, squash, badminton.
We decided that some people were getting a bit too old for rugby or football, so we decided we would play croquet. We had a lovely playing field right next to the brewery. None of us could play croquet, but we learned very quickly. We found it was an excellent game for taking part with other people at all levels, and it can be quite vicious. So croquet became almost our signature game at Watney's brewery for entertainment.
We had a sort of on-site club, social club, which is now offices, and we had a sports ground down the road.
Oh, it's really social. So this break room, which is not far from where reception is, they had the darts board, and everyone would go in there and play crib or cards, and it was just a nice little social 20 minutes to half an hour break in the morning and in the afternoon, getting everybody used to go.
The canteen was the melting pot. Like, you went in there for your breakfast and you had everyone in there, and you just you could sit back and just watch the show. We had some characters work here, and you just let them get on with it, don't get involved. And when you're new, you sort of think I'll just sit back and listen. And I knew a few people here anyway, but you just think I won't give it the big one because I just get slapped down, so I just keep quiet.
Your first day issue here, you got a pair of overalls, pair of protective boots, gloves and a pint mug. So I remember when I got mine, I said to the store, what pint mug for, mate? He said, well, there's a brewery in it, you get a beer. I never thought of that.
Well, one of the perks, obviously, is that there was a beer allowance. And typically that was 2 quarts a day at one time. Of the mile for the operators, senior managers were allowed the bitter.
The most important thing about Young's is that we were the last wet brewery in the country. Breweries were declared as either wet or dry. With a dry brewery, you could not drink on site, but you got an allowance to take home with you on a regular basis. A wet brewery is you can drink all you want on site pretty much, but you had to buy beer to take away with you at full price. With health and safety encroaching on most breweries, almost every brewery in the country became dry, apart from Young's.
Directly outside the office windows, there used to be a cellar flap, and there would be a firkin of pride put down there every week, or a firkin of bitter. And during tea breaks and lunch breaks, down would come the men from the offices, pipes on, cigarettes on, cigars, with their pots in their hand, the paper under their arms, and they would progress down to the office cellar. And they'd have a couple of pints at 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning. They'd be back down there again at lunchtime, and they'd go back in there again in the afternoon.
We also had a beer machine here. You got 10 tokens a week in your wage packet, which was 2 pints a day. And not everybody used to drink. They used to stick them in a bucket in what we called the mess room, where you'd sit and read your newspaper in between jobs, whatever. And they used to put them in a bucket there and people used to help themselves. But we had a fella here called Alan the Gallon. Now, he's quite a famous name here as a drayman. Alan would get his beer out of the beer machine and have a few pints before he started working. I've been out a few times with Alan. He was okay, he was quite a laugh, but to be truthful, he was useless. Because after a few beers, he'd be asleep in the cab, and 9 times out of 10 you'd done a job with your driver. Left Alan asleep in the cab.
If you wanted somebody to do a dirty job, you just said, can you do that and clean that mess up?
He said, "Oh, it's not my turn to do that, John. You just say, I'll give you a disc if you do it." And then they would do it, and of course then they would have an extra pint. I can't remember when the beer machine went, but that was a solemn day for everybody. It was almost like a funeral. I think the people did put RIP on the beer machine and whatever.
At Christmas, we used to get a Christmas card, and I hope the tax office isn't listening. They used to get a Christmas card with £250 cash in it. And then we used to get Christmas bonus that was paid into your wages of another £100. We'd get a 1.5 litre bottle of Ryland Ancient whiskey and this turkey that could feed about 5,000. Why they chose to have these largest turkeys ever, I don't know. And the thing is, they always gave the turkeys out on Christmas Eve or near his Christmas Eve. So most people used to go into the local pubs. It was tradition. You went to the pub at 11 o'clock on the last day when you finished work. This is 11 o'clock in the morning. And some people had these turkeys with them. And quite often, after Christmas, they'd say, "Don't know what happened to it. I left it somewhere." So there'd have been these turkeys defrosting in various places, yeah, but they were huge.
There was a lot of council housing in Chiswick where the workers would naturally come from. When the council house changes came in, where people were allowed to buy their council houses, so many people then ended up moving away, so they ended up not wanting to stay after work because they had to get home. And that sort of destroyed a lot of the social side of being at the brewery.
When I joined, the majority of people were employed in production, warehousing, distribution, which was very, very manual in those days. And the office staff were far, far fewer. We've probably got exactly the same number of people on site, but now all the people who aren't working in the warehouse anymore have been replaced with people in marketing, IT, finance, which have grown disproportionately.
New technology took over, so it wasn't manual work, it was more engineering work, and even the operators had to be a bit more technical because they were working with computers all the time. So that's where it changed, and then you got a different type of person. They weren't drinkers, you know. They were more university people. They wanted to have a glass of wine and go down and canapes and whatever. You know what I mean? It was totally different from wanting to go down the pub and have a beer and a pint and a pork pie. You know, that whole sort of culture went away.
A little bit different in the latter years, you know, the sort of last 7 or 8 years, because, I don't know, there was a lot more pressure on everybody, I think, you know. There was more jobs entailed more, especially in the offices and stuff like that, you know. People had to do more, and that community sort of thing wasn't the same, you know. But that was understandable, I think, you know, with the changes in their jobs and more pressure to do more hours and, you know, less money and stuff like that. It's the same everywhere.
As I say, there's the unpleasant period where we were having to reduce manpower in particular, having to cut costs on pretty well everything, and it became very much cost-driven and cost-centred, which is far less enjoyable.
We've always had a good relationship with Young's. When they closed, that was a real sad day for Fuller's, because we were losing our friends and the people we socialised with as well.
You know, they're sitting on a site that is worth more money to be developed than it is as a production brewery, and you know, particularly in the middle of Wandsworth. They were hemmed in. They literally could not expand the brewery anymore. They were hemmed in on all sides. They got a river, they got roads. It's terribly difficult to get anything in and out of the brewery. That pressure eventually meant that Young's closed.
The thing is, with the brewery, Young's was never supposed to get as big as it did get. And I think the options were, in those days, probably to shut the brewery and then build a new brewery somewhere out of London, a sort of brownfield site or something, which would have been incredibly expensive, or to amalgamate with a larger brewery. And the board at Young's chose to amalgamate with Charles Wells at the time.
It was awful, really. But
things have to move on, I suppose. And it was, quite depressing to sort of see the site empty for so long. End of an era.
Finally, again, you have this problem. You've got a huge property by the Thames. You've got very expensive housing areas all around you. What are you going to do with it? You're going to have an industrial production site there, which is not necessarily making you enormous returns, or are you going to sell it to a developer? Inevitably, selling it to a developer was the answer.
It's just sad that the breweries have gone now. I think it's a loss to the community, because it was the community, the breweries. It was a way of life that's not gone now, completely gone. Modern breweries are totally different. The high tech, all run with big valve blocks, computers. They press a button and start the process, and that's it. There's no soul to it.
Fuller's was about the only one left that was still able to maintain itself as an independent family brewer. But even then, you get a lot better return on your money as a retailer, as a pub owner, still, than you do as a brewer. And eventually, somebody came along and waved a very large cheque at them and said, "We would like to buy your brewery. You can carry on being pub retailers."
Sometimes in everyone's life you get something, and it's once in a lifetime. And I think this job was once in a lifetime.
I loved every day of it, and I wouldn't have swapped it for the world, and I would never have left if it hadn't have closed.
Really, really proud to have worked for a family firm for 43 years and not had to worry about anything. I haven't had to worry about security. I haven't had to worry about anything. I always knew that a job was there for me.
Everybody goes to work to make money, but it's not many places where you go to work, you make money, but you actually enjoy it. I can't remember one day getting on my bike in the morning, no matter what I'd been up to the night before, thinking, I've got to go there. All I could think about is, once I get there, it'll all be all right.